When a billionaire father's world is changed by a waitress who wipes his disabled son's tears, what happens next proves that true wealth lies in kindness and love. Richard Lawson was not just rich. He was one of the richest men in the city. People saw him as a powerful businessman, the kind who built empires, owned skyscrapers, and closed million-dollar deals over lunch. But behind the expensive suits and black-tinted cars was a man who was quietly breaking from the inside. His son, Ethan, was all he had left in the world. 9 years old, soft-spoken, and kind-eyed, Ethan had once been full of life. But now, he sat silently in a wheelchair, paralyzed. From the waist down, a quiet shadow of the boy he used to be. The car accident that changed everything had taken his mother, Laura, and with her. It had taken Ethan's ability to walk and Richard's ability to feel happiness. Richard often thought back to that night. They had been on the way home from a holiday celebration, just a normal drive. Laura was humming a song in the front seat. Ethan was asleep in the back, his arms wrapped around his new toy. One moment the road was clear, and the next there were headlights, screeching tires, and screams. Richard survived with minor injuries. Ethan didn't, and Laura never opened her eyes again. Since that day, their world had turned cold. Richard buried himself in work, believing money could fix things. He hired the best doctors, the finest therapists, the most experienced caregivers. Good. But Ethan, once a loud and joyful boy, barely spoke. He sat in his room for hours, staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. Richard knew he had to do more, but he didn't know how. He wasn't good with emotions, didn't know how to talk to a child, especially not one who had lost so much. So he decided to start small. Every Sunday he would take Ethan to a different cafe or restaurant. No bodyguards, no business calls, just the two of them. It was a quiet Sunday morning when they arrived at a small cafe on the edge of the city. It was nothing fancy. No golden decorations or expensive chandeliers, just wooden tables, the smell of fresh bread and soft music playing from a small speaker. Richard liked it because it was peaceful. Ethan liked it because no one stared at him. They sat near the window. Richard ordered pancakes for Ethan and coffee for himself, Ethan said. Nothing, just nodded when asked. His hands rested on the table, small and motionless. Across the cafe, a young waitress moved quickly between tables, carrying plates and taking orders. Her name was Sophie. She had kind eyes and a tired smile, the kind of smile that comes from someone who works hard but still tries to see the good in the world. She noticed the man in the suit and the quiet boy in the wheelchair. When she came to take their order, she greeted them with warmth. "Good morning, gentlemen. What can I get for you today?" Richard gave the order in his usual serious tone. Sophie smiled and turned to Ethan. "What about you, buddy? You like pancakes or waffles better?" she asked gently. Ethan looked up, surprised that someone was talking to him directly. He opened his mouth to speak but then looked down again. Sophie noticed the hesitation but didn't push. "I'll surprise you," she said with a wink. A few minutes later, she returned with pancakes shaped like a smiley face, syrup on the side. In a small cup of chocolate milk. Ethan blinked, surprised. Richard glanced at the plate and then at Sophie, slightly amused. "I thought he might like it this way," Sophie said with a grin. Richard nodded slightly. "Thank you." To eat in silence. Richard scrolled through his phone, checking emails. Ethan picked at his food slowly. Then something small but important happened. Ethan tried to cut the pancake with his knife and fork, but struggled. His hands weren't as strong as before. His grip slipped, and the fork fell on the floor. Richard didn't notice. Still. Reading something on his phone, Ethan looked at the fork, his bottom lip trembling. The noise of the cafe faded into the background. His shoulders dropped. Tears started forming in his eyes. He tried to wipe them away with the sleeve of his shirt, but they kept coming. Sophie, who had been watching from behind the counter, noticed the boy's distress. She walked over, slowly and gently. She didn't say anything at first. She just knelt beside Ethan and pulled out a napkin from her apron pocket. "Hey," she said softly, "it's okay." She gently wiped his tears, her touch careful and respectful. Ethan looked at her, confused and overwhelmed. She smiled. "Do you want me to help with the pancake?" Ethan nodded slowly. Sophie took the fork and knife and began cutting the pancake into small, easy-to-handle pieces. She placed the fork back into his hand and helped guide it to his plate. "There you go, champ." Teamwork, right? Ethan gave a small smile. It was quick and faded fast, but it was a smile, the first one Richard had seen in weeks. He had looked up just in time to witness the moment. For a few seconds he said nothing. He just stared at the young waitress kneeling next to his son, treating him not like a burden, not like a poor disabled child, but like a person, like a child who deserved love and kindness. Richard felt something heavy in his chest. Guilt, maybe, or sadness, or both. Sophie stood up and gave Ethan a thumbs up before walking away. She didn't expect anything in return. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just being human. The rest of the meal passed quietly. Ethan ate slowly, but more confidently. Richard watched him, still thinking about the moment, before leaving. He asked to see the manager and left a generous tip, saying nothing about why. As they stepped out into the sunlight, Richard looked at Ethan. "Did you like the pancakes?" Ethan nodded. "She was nice, wasn't she?" Ethan looked up. "Yes." He whispered. It was one word. But for Richard, it was everything. That night, Richard sat alone in his study thinking. For years, he had believed that solving problems meant throwing money at them. He had paid for the best of everything. Yet a young woman earning minimum wage had done something none of his staff could make his son smile. The next morning, Richard found himself thinking about that cafe again. Not just about the food or the peace, but about the way that girl had treated Ethan. No pity, no awkwardness, just kindness. He didn't know why, but something about her stayed in his mind. Maybe it was the way she looked at Ethan. Maybe it was the way she didn't look at Richard like he was someone important. She just cared. He realized something else that night. He had never actually told Ethan how sorry he was. He had never really sat down with him, listened to him, or asked him what he needed. He had let guilt turn into silence. And now it was time to change that. Over the next few days, Richard made small changes. He left work earlier, tried to eat dinner with Ethan. They didn't talk much, but it was a start. Ethan seemed confused at first, but then he slowly began to accept it. On Sunday, they returned to the same cafe. This time, Richard hoped that same waitress would be there. She was. And this time, when she came to their table, Ethan smiled before she even said hello. That small moment made Richard believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. And it all started with a simple act of kindness. A waitress wiping a tear from a little boy's cheek. Sophie had never planned to become a waitress. She had dreams once, big dreams. She wanted to be a teacher, maybe even open a small art studio where she could help kids express themselves. But life doesn't always follow dreams. Throws you into storms you're not ready for, and all you can do is learn to swim. She was only 19 when everything changed. Her father left one morning without a word, and her mother followed a few weeks later. They had fought a lot, and Sophie had always tried to protect her younger brother Max from the shouting. Max was different. He didn't talk much, didn't like loud noises, and hated changes in routine. Doctors had said he was on the autism spectrum. Sophie didn't fully understand what that meant at the time, but she knew one thing: Max needed her. So she dropped out of college and took 2 jobs. One at a local diner during the day, and another cleaning offices at night. Her life became a cycle of work, cooking meals for Max, helping him with school, and praying they wouldn't lose the small apartment they rented. She was tired all the time, but she never complained. Max was her world, and she would do anything to keep him safe. The cafe where she worked on weekends was one of her calmer jobs. It wasn't very busy most of the time, and the customers were usually kind. She liked watching people, making small jokes with old couples, or smiling at shy kids. It was during one of these quiet mornings that she noticed a man in a suit and a little boy in a wheelchair sitting near the window. She didn't know who they were. The man looked serious, like someone who didn't smile much. The boy looked sad, his face still, his eyes distant. But when Sophie brought over the pancake shaped like a smiley face, something shifted in the air. The boy's expression changed for just a second, and that small shift stayed with her. What really touched Sophie's heart was the moment she knelt down and saw the boy crying silently. She had seen that kind of sadness before. It was the same sadness Max had when he felt helpless or ignored. She couldn't just walk past him. She did what came naturally. She wiped his tears and offered help. She didn't care about how rich or important the man at the table might be. All she saw was a child who needed kindness. She thought it was just a moment, nothing big. She didn't expect them to come back the next Sunday. But when they did, she noticed something different. The boy smiled when he saw her. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. That moment warmed her heart more than any tip ever could. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Ethan kept coming back to the cafe. And each time Sophie found herself looking forward to seeing them. She would bring Ethan small surprises: a cookie, shaped like a dinosaur, a drawing she made of a superhero in a wheelchair, or a small paper airplane with his name on it. Ethan began to open up. He didn't talk much, but he started nodding more, smiling more, and sometimes even whispering a few words. Sophie had a natural gift. She knew how to talk to children without talking down to them. She didn't treat Ethan like someone broken or weak. She treated him like a regular boy, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, after they had finished their meal, Richard asked to speak with her. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said, his voice calm but serious. "But do you ever do part-time work outside the cafe?" Sophie was surprised. "What kind of work?" "My son Ethan. He seems to like you. Doesn't usually connect with people. I was wondering if you'd be willing to spend some time with him. Not as a nurse or anything formal, just company, art, games, maybe help with some schoolwork." "I'll pay you well." Sophie hesitated. She wasn't used to people offering her money for kindness. She didn't want to cross any lines. "Look," Richard added, noticing her worry, "I understand if it's too much. But you've done something no therapist or professional has managed in years. You've made him feel safe." Sophie thought about Max. She thought about the long hours she worked and how difficult it was to find moments of peace. The idea of doing something meaningful, even for a few hours a week, sounded nice. She looked at Ethan, who was drawing quietly at the table. "Okay," she said finally, "but only if Ethan wants me to." Ethan looked up at her and gave the smallest nod. That was enough. From that week onward, Sophie began visiting their home twice a week. Richard sent a driver to pick her up and drop her off. The mansion she arrived at was nothing like the life she lived. It had wide halls, high ceilings, and walls filled with paintings. But despite its size, the house felt quiet, too quiet. It was like walking into a museum where everything was perfect, but no one smiled. Ethan showed her his room. It was big and filled with toys and gadgets, but Sophie noticed something strange. None of the toys looked used. They were neatly arranged, untouched. It was like they were gifts from someone who didn't know how to give love, only things. She started with simple activities: drawing, painting, reading stories. Slowly, she introduced little games, puzzles, and even some music. Ethan responded well. He liked drawing the most. He would sit for hours with colored pencils, creating pictures of forests, superheroes, animals, and sometimes sad faces that Sophie understood without explanation. One day, Ethan drew a picture of a stick figure in a wheelchair with a cape flying in the wind. Next to him was another stick figure with brown hair and a giant smile. He gave the drawing to Sophie. "That's me?" she asked, surprised. He nodded. "Wow," she said, holding back tears. "I've never looked cooler." Richard watched all of this from a distance. At first he stayed out of their way, letting them have time together. But after a while, he started joining them, sitting nearby, asking questions, and eventually laughing at their jokes. He hadn't laughed in years, not like that. He learned things about his son. He never knew how much he loved art, how he remembered every small detail of his mother's face, and how he hated the silence in their big house. Sophie helped open a door Richard didn't know how to unlock. She never acted like a teacher or a therapist. She acted like a friend. Maybe that was exactly what Ethan had been missing. One evening, after Sophie had left, Richard sat in the living room with Ethan. "She's nice, isn't she?" Richard said. Ethan nodded. "She listens." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Do you think I don't listen?" Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You try, but you're busy." Richard felt those words like a punch. It was the truth. He had been so focused on fixing things with money that he forgot what his son really needed: his time. The next day, Richard cleared his calendar, called off meetings and canceled trips. Instead, he spent the day with Ethan and Sophie, painting in the garden. The sun was warm, the air soft, and for the first time in years, felt like life was breathing again. Sophie never asked about Richard's money. She didn't care about the mansion or the luxury cars. In fact, she still went back to work at the cafe and continued taking care of Max at night. But slowly, she found herself caring deeply for Ethan. She saw so much of her brother in him: sweet, quiet, needing someone to believe in him. Richard started asking about her life. When he learned about Max, he was surprised. He had assumed Sophie was just a cheerful girl with an easy life. But she was strong in ways most people couldn't imagine. Raising a special needs sibling alone, working 2 jobs, and still managing to smile. That was strength. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Richard thanked her. "You've given my son something priceless," he said. "I don't even know how to thank you." Sophie shook her head. "You don't have to. He's a great kid. I'm lucky to know him." Richard looked at her and saw something rare: genuine goodness. She wasn't impressed by his money or status. She wasn't pretending. She was real. He realized then that the person who had made the biggest difference in his son's life wasn't a doctor, a therapist, or a private tutor. It was a waitress who wiped away tears without asking for anything in return. What neither of them knew at the time was that their lives were slowly beginning to change forever. A bond was forming, quiet and strong, built not on wealth or contracts, but on care, trust, and love. The days started to feel different. Sophie began visiting Richard and Ethan regularly. What had started as a few casual visits turned into something much more meaningful. Not just for Ethan, but for Sophie and Richard as well. The large mansion, once cold and quiet, started to feel a little warmer, a little more alive. And it was all because of Sophie's presence. Ethan looked forward to her visits. Every time the doorbell rang and Sophie stepped in with her cheerful smile and her worn-out backpack, his face lit up. He'd even ask the housekeeper what time Sophie would arrive, something he never did for anyone else. With her, he felt safe. With her, he didn't feel like the kid in the wheelchair. He felt like a boy who could still laugh, draw, and be heard. Their afternoons together were filled with fun and learning. They painted side by side, built silly stories out of random drawings, and once even created a puppet show using socks and sticks. Sophie never made a big deal about Ethan's disability. She didn't speak slowly or pity him. Instead, she treated him like she would treat her younger brother. Max with understanding, patience, and honesty. One afternoon, while they were painting in the garden, Sophie told Ethan about Max. She didn't go into every detail, but shared enough for Ethan to understand that Max was special too. He doesn't like loud noises. Sometimes he covers his ears when there are too many people around, Sophie said, dipping her brush into a bright blue color. But he's super smart. He remembers things no one else does, like he can name every single dinosaur in order. Ethan giggled. "That's cool. I like dinosaurs too." "Then you and Max would be best friends," Sophie said, smiling. Ethan looked thoughtful. "Do you take care of him?" "Yeah, it's just me and him," she replied. "We've been a team for a long time now." Ethan glanced at Richard, who was sitting on the porch reading but keeping an eye on them. "My dad works a lot." Sophie nodded. "Sometimes people work too much because they don't know how to fix things with their hearts. So they try to fix them with their hands instead." Ethan didn't fully understand what she meant, but something about it made sense to him. Later that evening, when Sophie had gone home, Ethan asked his father a quiet question. "Dad, do you like Sophie?" Richard looked up, surprised. "Yes, I think she's wonderful." "Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged. "She listens better than the other people." That night, Richard sat awake in his study. He thought about Ethan's words. She listens better. It wasn't something complicated. It wasn't about education or money. It was about presence. Sophie had a way of making people feel like they mattered, and she did it without effort. Richard wondered when was the last time he truly listened to someone, especially his own son. The next few weeks passed in a gentle rhythm. Sophie visited often. Richard began joining them more and more. Sometimes he'd sit with them and try his hand at painting, which made them all laugh. He wasn't very good at it. Other times he helped Ethan with a Lego set or just watched. The two of them built forts out of couch cushions and blankets in the living room. Something was changing inside Richard. He no longer checked his phone every minute. He canceled a few business dinners to stay home. He stopped bringing his laptop to the breakfast table. People at his office noticed, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like a father again. One day, Richard asked Sophie if she and Max would like to have dinner at the house. It was a small gesture, but for Sophie, it meant a lot. She agreed, and the following Friday, she brought Max over. Max was quiet when they arrived. He stayed close to Sophie, his eyes scanning everything. The house was big, almost too big for her. Someone like Max, who liked familiar places. But when Ethan rolled up to him and handed him a small toy dinosaur, Max's eyes lit up. "This is a T-Rex," he whispered, holding it carefully. "Yep," Ethan said. "I have a bunch. You can play with them." The two boys didn't say much, but they sat on the floor, playing side by side. It was enough. Sophie and Richard sat in the living room watching them. "He's good with Max," she said softly. "And you're good with Ethan," Richard replied. They looked at each other, and for a moment there was silence. Not the awkward, kind, but the quiet space where something real lives, as days turned into weeks. Richard and Sophie found themselves talking more. Not just about Ethan, but about life, about their pasts, about things they had lost and things they still hoped for. Richard told her how guilty he felt every day about the accident. He confessed how helpless he felt, how he tried to fix everything. With money, because it was the only thing he knew. Sophie listened without judgment. "You can't buy healing," she said gently, "but you can build it, one small moment at a time." Richard nodded. "You've done more for my son in a few weeks than I have in years." Sophie shook her head. "No, you're here. You stayed. That counts for everything." Their bond grew quietly. There were no big confessions or dramatic moments, just little signs, longer conversations, shared smiles, warm silences. Sophie never asked for anything. She still worked her jobs. She still took care of Max, but she always made time for Ethan, and Ethan thrived. His laughter returned. He started painting dream worlds filled with color and hope. He asked more questions, gave more answers, and once even told Sophie that he wanted to grow up and help kids like Max. One sunny afternoon, Richard surprised them both by setting up an art room in the house, just for Ethan. It had shelves full of paints, brushes, crayons, and sketch pads. There was a big window with natural light, and in one corner, a soft reading chair. When Ethan saw it, his eyes widened. He looked at his father, unsure. "For you," Richard said, "so you and Sophie can make more amazing things." Ethan hugged him. It was the first time in a long time that he had done that. As they sat in the new art room, Sophie looked around and smiled. "This place has heart now." "It's because of you," Richard said quietly. She turned to him. "No, it's because of Ethan?" Richard nodded. "And you helped him find it again." Everything seemed to be going well, but underneath the calm, something else was starting to stir. Richard's world was public. He was a billionaire after all. And people had started to notice his changing routine, his sudden interest in a simple cafe, and his quiet friendship with a waitress no one knew much about. One evening, as Sophie was walking out of the house, she noticed a man in a car parked nearby taking photos. She didn't think much of it until a few days later when her phone started buzzing. Photos of her with Ethan, with Richard walking into the mansion, even a blurry one of her hugging McSoul over the internet. The headline screamed, "Billionaire's mysterious nanny, waitress, or gold digger? Who is the woman melting Richard Lawson's heart?" Sophie was horrified. Reporters showed up outside her apartment. Some of them even followed her. To work, Max got scared. He started refusing to go to school. People whispered at the cafe. Some regular customers didn't come back. She didn't want to believe it. But deep down, she knew this was because of Richard. That evening, she went to the mansion with a heavy heart. Aunt Richard opened the door, smiling, but his face dropped. When he saw her expression, "You knew this could happen," she said, holding up her phone. "I didn't expect it to blow up like this," he replied. Clearly shaken. "I'm not built for this world, Richard. I'm just trying to take care of my brother and live a quiet life. I didn't sign up to be someone's scandal," Richard tried to explain. He offered protection, legal help, even money. But Sophie stopped him. "No, that's the problem. Every time something goes wrong, you throw money at it. This isn't about money. This is about trust." He looked at her, his voice low. "Please don't walk away." She took a breath, tears in her eyes. "I love Ethan, but I have to protect my own family too." She left quietly. Richard stood at the door for a long time, unable to move. Ethan waited in the art room for Sophie that evening. He sat there for hours, holding the drawing he made for her. A picture of 3 stick figures, him, Sophie, and Max under a tree, with the words, "My best day," but she didn't come. The next day, Ethan didn't eat breakfast. He didn't smile. He didn't paint. The house felt cold again. Richard sat beside his son, unsure of what to say. Had lost something precious. Just Sophie, but the light she had brought into their lives. And deep down, he knew this time he couldn't fix it. After Sophie left the mansion, everything felt different. The house that once held laughter and warmth turned quiet and empty. Ethan's world suddenly seemed smaller, darker, as if the color had been drained from his life. He sat in his new art room, staring at the drawings he had made, with Sophie vivid pictures of happy days, sunshine, and friendship. But now, they felt like memories from a dream. Richard watched his son and felt helpless. He saw the sadness in Ethan's eyes and knew the truth. Sophie was more than just a helper. She had become a part of their family. Without her, the house felt hollow. But Richard also understood the world Sophie came from. The public attention, the gossip, the pressure, they were too much for her. And maybe he had pushed too hard, dragging her into a life she wasn't ready for. He tried to reach out to her. He called, sent messages, asked his assistants to contact her family, but Sophie didn't answer. She needed space. She needed to protect Max. She needed to find her strength again. At the cafe where Sophie worked, things had changed too. Regular customers whispered when she walked in, and the manager warned her to be careful with the media. Sophie felt alone in a way she never had before. The small world she had built around Max, her jobs and her dreams, was now invaded by strangers. Max noticed Sophie's sadness. He didn't understand everything, but he knew when she was upset. One evening, as they sat together eating dinner, Max looked at Sophie and said, "Why do people not like you?" Sophie smiled weakly, brushing back his hair. "Sometimes people don't understand things that are different or new. But we just keep being ourselves, right?" Max nodded. "We are a team." That small moment gave Sophie the strength she needed. She promised herself she wouldn't give up, not on Ethan, not on Richard, and not on her own dreams. She had come this far, and she would fight for what mattered. Meanwhile, Richard was making changes. He started hiring a new team to handle the media, trying to protect Sophie and his family. He arranged for private security, better privacy at the mansion, even began a public campaign to raise awareness about autism and the challenges his families face. But what touched people most was Richard's own story. He shared his struggles as a father of a disabled child, his guilt over being absent, and his journey to understand what real love and care meant. The story moved many hearts, and people began to see Sophie not as a mysterious woman, but as a hero, the one who helped a family heal. Sophie, hearing all this from afar, was touched, but still cautious. She knew the real healing wouldn't come from media or money. It would come from trust and time. One day, Sophie received a letter. It was from Richard. He wrote about how much they missed her and Ethan. He promised he would never let the world's noise drown out what was important again. He said he wanted to meet with her, just the two of them. Without cameras or reporters, Sophie thought long and hard. Her heart told her to go. Her mind warned her of the risks. But love and hope won. She agreed to meet Richard at a quiet cafe, far from the city's busy streets. When they saw each other again, there was a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, but also hope. They talked for hours. Sophie told Richard how much she loved Ethan, how much she cared for Max, and how scared she was of losing them both. Richard apologized for dragging her into his complicated world and promised to protect her and her family that day. They made a new promise not just to each other, but to Ethan and Max. They would work together, face challenges together, and create a family that didn't care about money or fame, but about love, understanding, and acceptance. Ethan was the first to know about the reunion. When Sophie and Richard arrived at the mansion together, Ethan's eyes sparkled with joy. He ran to Sophie, hugged her tightly, and then looked up at his father. "Can we paint now?" he asked eagerly. Richard smiled, feeling a new beginning. In his heart, the months that followed were filled with healing and growth. Sophie, Richard, Ethan, and Max became a true family. They spent time together, painting, playing, and sharing stories. Sophie helped Richard understand the small joys and struggles of raising a child with special needs. Dreams, helping her enroll back in college to study education and art therapy. Their journey wasn't easy. There were days filled with frustration, tears, and setbacks. But through it all, they never gave up. They learned that love was not perfect. It was patient, kind, and sometimes messy. But it was worth fighting for. One evening, Richard organized a small gathering at the mansion. He invited close friends and family to celebrate the progress Ethan had made and to honor Sophie's incredible kindness and strength. As Sophie stood beside Ethan, surrounded by people who loved and respected her, she realized how far she had come from a young waitress struggling to survive to the heart of a family's healing. Richard raised his glass and said, "To Sophie, a woman who wiped away tears, healed hearts, and taught us all what true love really means." Everyone cheered. Sophie looked at Ethan, who smiled shyly but proudly. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because family is not about money or status, it's about love, it's a trust, and the courage to believe in each other. After the celebration at the mansion, life continued to change for all of them. Sophie, Richard, Ethan, and Max had grown closer than ever before, but their journey was far from over. Every day brought new challenges, but also new joys and discoveries. What made everything worthwhile was the deep bond they had built, a bond made not from riches or convenience, but from genuine love and commitment. Sophie had started attending college courses during the day, studying education and art therapy. Her dream was to help children like Ethan and Max. Children who needed someone who understood their world, who could see beyond their disabilities to their true potential. Richard supported her fully, even hiring tutors for Max so Sophie could focus on her studies. Ethan loved the new art room that Richard had set up for him. It became his favorite place in the house. Every afternoon, he would rush there with his paints and brushes, eager to create worlds full of colors and stories. Sophie often joined him, sometimes guiding him, sometimes just sitting quietly beside him while he worked. Richard, too, found himself transformed. He had once thought that money could solve everything, and now he understood that real change came from time, patience, and presence. He spent more time with Ethan, learning how to care for him, how to listen when words were hard to find. He learned to celebrate small victories the first time Ethan spoke a new word. The day he managed to use his wheelchair on his own, the moments when his laughter filled the house. Their lives weren't perfect. There were still difficulties. Some days Ethan would become frustrated or upset, and Sophie and Richard would have to find ways to calm him down. Max had his own challenges, and Sophie struggled to balance her studies, work, and caring for her brother and new family. But they faced everything together, always reminding each other that they were not alone. One particularly difficult day came when Ethan had a severe episode. He was upset, confused, and unable to communicate his feelings. Sophie and Richard stayed by his side, trying to soothe him, but nothing seemed to work. For hours, the house was filled with tension and worry. Finally, Sophie had an idea. She brought out a photo album filled with pictures of happy memories, Ethan's birthday parties, family trips, and moments with Sophie and Max. Slowly, Ethan's eyes softened as he looked at the images. He reached out to touch Sophie's hand, then smiled faintly. That small breakthrough reminded them all why they kept going. It was never about avoiding hardship. It was about finding hope within it. As time passed, the media frenzy around Sophie and Richard quieted down. The public saw the genuine care and respect between them. Richard used his influence to start a foundation to support families with disabled children. Naming it after Ethan, Sophie became a spokesperson for special education. Speaking from her heart about the struggles and joys of raising children with disabilities, their story inspired many people. It showed that love and understanding could break down walls, heal wounds, and build new futures. One afternoon, Sophie received a letter from her mother. It had been years since they last spoke. The letter was simple but full of hope. Her mother wanted to reconnect, to understand the family Sophie had built, and to support her. Sophie felt a wave of emotion. She showed the letter to Richard and Ethan. Together, they talked about forgiveness and second chances. With Richard's encouragement, Sophie decided to meet her mother. It was not easy. Old wounds ran deep, and there were fears of being hurt again. But the meeting was gentle. They talked, cried, and slowly started to rebuild a relationship. That day, Sophie realized that family was not just the people you were born with, but also the people you chose, and who chose you. Ethan's school. Year was ending, and he was ready to move to a more specialized program to help him grow. On his last day, the teachers praised his progress. They said he had come so far, not just academically, but emotionally. Sophie and Richard felt proud, but knew the journey ahead was long. On the night before Ethan's new school started, they all sat together in the living room. Ethan held Sophie's hand, and Max sat close by. Richard looked around at his new family and felt a deep peace. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," he said softly. "You're stronger than you know." Ethan smiled shyly and looked at Sophie. "Thank you for staying," Sophie smiled back. "I'll always be here." That night, Richard thought about everything they had been through. The accident that changed their lives, the tears wiped away by a kind waitress, struggles, the media storms, the healing. He realized that none of it was a mistake. It had brought them to this moment, a moment of hope, love, and new beginnings. The story of a billionaire dad watching a waitress wipe his disabled son's tears had touched many hearts because it was about something universal: the power of kindness, the courage to change, and the strength to keep believing in family. Richard and Sophie's journey taught everyone that no matter how hard life gets, love is the greatest gift we can give and receive. And for Ethan, surrounded by those who loved him, the future was full of endless possibilities.